After watching this video, you will be able to explain the 5 parts of the storyline and define each part. So let's look at the storyline. So the storyline looks like this. As we are reading a piece of fiction, the story begins to increase with tension as it goes along. Then we get to the very top part of the story, the part where the conflict is dealt with. And then, as you see, it goes down. So our tension in the story starts to decrease and finally ends. Notice the left side is longer than the right side because a story usually has more events on this part of the story. Here's our first part of the storyline. Look at your notes. At the bottom of the arc, please write the word exposition in the blank with the number 1. Later on, we're going to define each of these terms, but go ahead and label them on your storyline. The next part, which is the entire line that rises up, this is the rising action. So again, this isn't just the middle of that line. It is the entire line that goes all the way up to the top point of this mountain-looking line. The next part is the climax, number 3. Number 4 is falling action. And number 5 is resolution. Make sure that you've written all 5 of these terms next to the storyline in the correct blanks. If you need to pause to have more time to write, please do that now. Let's define each of these parts of the storyline. The first part of the storyline is the exposition. This is the very beginning of our storyline, the first event. In the exposition, you are introduced to the characters, setting, and basic situation. So you get to know who the story is about, where the story is taking place, what time period the story is taking place, and just what the general event is that your story is going to tell about. The next part of the storyline is the rising action. This is where the tension begins to increase. So events are introduced and you have a conflict. And then it increases as the characters have to deal with that conflict. So again, rising action isn't just the middle of this line, it is the entire line that is rising up because the characters are dealing with the conflict and it's building and building until we get to our next part of the storyline. The peak of the storyline is called the climax. Now in elementary school, you might have been told that the climax is the most exciting part of the story. That's not necessarily the best definition because sometimes we have an intense part of a story and it may not necessarily be the climax. So it's not the most exciting part. It is the turning point in the story when the conflict is dealt with. So when the character finally has to deal with that conflict. And it's not always when the conflict is solved, because sometimes we have stories where the problem isn't solved. The characters don't end up happily ever after. Sometimes they do. But during this part, the peak of the storyline is the climax. And this is one of the most important parts of a story because it's usually where our characters change or they learn something. And so we always want to figure out what is the climax because that usually is going to help us lead to the main point of a story. So after the climax, when the conflict is dealt with, we don't just end the story. We have to kind of wrap things up. And that's what the falling action is. So the falling action are the events after the climax where the tension starts to decrease. Characters start to kind of wrap up and kind of see where they are after the conflict was dealt with. So usually this is not a lot of events. If you look on the storyline, the right side of the storyline is not very long. There are not very many falling actions. There's usually a couple, maybe one or two, but it's not a very long part of the story. The final part of the storyline is the resolution. This is the last point of the storyline, and it's usually only just one event, the very last thing. It's the last event, and you have loose ends that you have to kind of tie up. So this is kind of our that's all folks moment in a story, the very last thing. Check your notes. Make sure that you have labeled your storyline. Make sure that you have all of the blanks filled in under that storyline diagram. And make sure that if you missed anything, you go back and listen to part of this presentation again.